Democratic organizational meeting, which will run certainly all morning. And as you know, we had an all-day organizational meeting yesterday. I regret that we have a hearing in the middle of that, and I know you indicated yesterday that empty chairs should not be misconstrued, but I have a solemn obligation to elect the next leadership of this body. Unfortunately, that conflicts with this hearing. It means no disrespect to our witnesses and certainly to the topic. As the chairman knows and the ranking member knows, I don't like to miss hearings of any kind. And I regret, unfortunately, I am going to have to leave. I will insert a statement for the record, and I thank the chair.
Yeah, this is as good a time as any, I guess, to say what we said yesterday, which is there's really never a good time to have leadership races. And given, you know, the seriousness of this subject matter and the fact that we've had to reschedule it multiple times in the past, no witness should take from the absence of any member that they're not interested in it. It's just a tough time of the year to try to fit everything in. So we'll do the best we can and take people in the order in which they come. With that, the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform will come to order. Without objection, the presiding member is authorized to declare recess at any time. I am going to recognize my friend and my classmate and soon-to-be departing member of Congress from the great state of Florida, Mr. Dennis Ross, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for holding this hearing today. A little over a year ago, Hurricanes Irma and Maria hit the United States, combined with Hurricane Harvey and the fires in California. These back-to-back disasters were unprecedented. In fact, a year ago, I had the opportunity that I would challenge my colleagues to do also, and that's to join NOAA in a hurricane hunter and fly through a storm. I spent 4 hours in the middle of a Category 5 Hurricane Irma, and I learned very much how devastating and destructive these natural disasters can be, and I also learned how to strengthen my faith. The committee is meeting today to review the 2017 hurricane season, and more importantly at this stage to discuss how federal agencies are applying lessons learned so our country is better prepared for major natural disasters in the future. FEMA estimates that nearly 10% of the entire U.S. population was affected by the storms last year, and the agency approved more than 1.6 million applications for assistance, including more than 777,000 applications in my home state of Florida. Over the past year, federal officials, territories, state and local governments, and countless nonprofits have endeavored to repair roads, remove debris, restore power, and rebuild communities. The human toll is incalculable, and we cannot discount the fact that for many families who lost homes and loved ones, life will never be the same. Still, disasters are a reality of the world we live in. We know eventually the United States will face another catastrophic storm or natural disaster. That's why advanced planning, something that we don't do too well here, but yet is necessary, informed by lessons learned from previous disasters, is critically important. Disaster response and recovery programs can be complicated. In many cases, there are no easy solutions. Some challenges, such as providing housing to disaster survivors, continue to recur because natural disasters tend to affect the local housing supply. But FEMA has a wealth of knowledge to draw on as it continues to implement much-needed reforms. This committee, Congress in general, GAO, and various industry and oversight groups have made numerous observations and recommendations about how to improve federal disaster response and recovery. FEMA itself issued an after-action report earlier this summer. The hearing today will provide an opportunity to discuss some of these potential reforms. One of the primary issues the agency has faced for many years, though, is staffing. Quite simply, FEMA's past and present leadership has not taken adequate steps to address a systemic lack of appropriately trained and qualified staff. Because many of these employees are on the front lines assisting individual disaster survivors and state local government officials, it is imperative that FEMA deploy knowledgeable staff who are capable of providing clear, consistent, and accurate guidance about FEMA's assistance programs. One of Administrator Long's strategic goals for FEMA is to reduce the complexity in order to support outcome-based recovery. I laud you on that goal, and I hope we're able to achieve that. But that cannot happen until FEMA ensures its workforce is ready for the job at hand. At the same time, I want to emphasize that response and recovery is not FEMA's task alone. In our federalist system of government, the federal bureaucracy cannot and should not run disaster response and recovery single-handedly. States, territories, and local governments need to have their own plans in place and take steps to prepare their communities. You know, resiliency is very, very important. We can prepare for resiliency. Last year, we saw the consequences of unpreparedness and lack of planning. We cannot afford to make the same mistake again. FEMA, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and other federal agencies and governments at all levels across the country must take this opportunity to reflect, apply lessons learned, and ensure our nation is better prepared for future disasters. Tomorrow, the 2018 Atlantic hurricane season will finally come to a close. In light of the storms that affected the United States this year, this hearing is particularly timely because Congress needs to hear from FEMA and the Corps about how their efforts this year were informed by lessons learned from last year. With that, I yield back, Chairman.
Gentleman from Florida yields back. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for holding this hearing. Last year, after devastating hurricanes slammed into Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, President Trump repeatedly touted his administration's response as, quote, unbelievable, amazing, and incredible, end of quote. Unfortunately, the facts on the ground show just the opposite. The Trump administration completely botched a massive $156 million contract to deliver 30 million emergency meals in the aftermath of the storm. They ignored one of the key lessons from Hurricane Katrina, setting up advanced contracts for emergency provisions. Instead, they rushed to give this huge contract to a tiny one-person company with a terrible and obvious history of failing much smaller contracts. Predictably, they had to cancel the contract, all while thousands of starving American citizens were in desperate need of food. My staff uncovered this issue with absolutely no help from FEMA or the Department of Homeland Security or the White House. Despite our multiple letters requesting documents to explain this massive screw-up, we have not received one document regarding this issue. The Trump administration also completely failed to respond to desperate pleas for help from grocery stores that needed fuel to keep their food from spoiling, including tons of produce, dairy, and other perishables. My staff obtained documents showing that Walmart, explaining repeatedly that their grocery stores had generators in place, but they needed emergency fuel to keep the food from spoiling. Puerto Rican officials communicated these concerns directly to FEMA in person and in writing. But by September 27, a full week after the hurricane, no fuel was provided. Again, the Trump administration has refused to provide any of the documents we requested regarding this massive, and I mean massive, failure. Nearly 3,000 people died. 3,000 people died in this tragedy, more than in Hurricane Katrina. But rather than recognizing any failings by his own administration, President Trump accused Democrats of somehow manufacturing the death count. He tweeted, and I quote, "This was done by the Democrats in order to make me look as bad as possible," end of quote. Today, I'm releasing additional documents that also contradict President Trump's claims about his administration's response. Specifically, I'm releasing an email sent on November 29, 2017, 70 days after the hurricane struck. The email was sent to Mike Byrne, the top FEMA official overseeing the response in Puerto Rico. The senator's name is redacted, but it is from someone on the ground in Vieques, in Puerto Rico. This email warns that the conditions remain dire and, quote, with limited to no communications, quote, end of quote, and that, quote, gas lines are in excess of 6 hours at times due to inconsistent delivery, end of quote. The email concludes this, and I quote, Mr. Byrne, we need help. More than 2 months following Hurricane Maria, we are watching our local electric crews struggle to repair the system with no equipment and no material. We are hearing estimates that we will be 1 year without regular power. Why? End of quote. We can do better than this. The email was provided to a congressional office and directly to FEMA Administrator Brock Long. The forwarding email stated, and I quote, here is another example. I know that you have had a rough time in Houston, but at least you had competent people in charge of the response. We have incompetent people in charge here and are getting no response to our urgent needs. First of all, restoration of power. Please share this with Representative McCall, along with our urgent request for the Committee on Homeland Security to convene hearings on the utter failure of the federal response here and on the main island of Puerto Rico, end of quote. We have no record of whether Administrator Long responded to this email. Instead, we have press reports and Inspector General findings that Administrator Long abused his position of trust as the head of FEMA and charged the taxpayers tens of thousands of dollars for his personal use of government vehicles, which included a trip to Hawaii where a government employee shuttled his family around the island. Unfortunately and regrettably, this committee has failed the American people as well. In the immediate days after the hurricane, I asked the chairman to follow the bipartisan example of our former chairman, Representative Tom Davis, a Republican who investigated the Bush administration's response to Hurricane Katrina. I asked him to send the same letters that Chairman Davis sent to federal agencies and to the White House. Chairman Davis obtained more than 22,000 pages of documents from the Bush White House. And he also obtained a briefing from the top White House official in charge of the response. In contrast, Chairman Gowdy would not even send a letter to the White House. He would not ask for a single document. And we have not received a single document. This committee walled off the White House from scrutiny at the same time that President Trump was claiming that up is down and down is up. I greatly respect the chairman as a person, as an attorney, and as a friend. But this is not transparency. This is not accountability. And this is certainly not oversight. So with that, let me take care of a few housekeeping matters and ask unanimous consent on several motions. First, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record all of our letters regarding the botched $166 million contract to deliver 30 million meals to people of Puerto Rico.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also ask unanimous consent to enter into the record all of our letters regarding the Trump administration's failure to respond to urgent pleas from grocery stores to obtain fuel to run generators to prevent food spoilage.
Without objection.
Thank you. In addition, I ask unanimous consent that the new emails I'm releasing today that were sent to Administrator Long be entered into the hearing record.
Without objection.
Next, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record this excellent report that our staff compiled based on our own independent investigation of the Trump administration failures.
Without objection.
Finally, I want to make clear that the Democrats asked for this hearing back on September 29th, 2017, more than a year ago. I ask unanimous consent that the letter from me and Ranking Member Plaskett be entered into the record.
Without objection.
Unfortunately, despite our requests, the committee held no hearings on the hurricanes in the past 14 months. Instead, this hearing was scheduled for today, which is the same day that we, as Democrats, have to be up and down in the Longworth building, organizing our entire caucus and voting on leadership positions and establishing our rules for the next Congress. Our Republican colleagues have promised to accommodate us, and I appreciate it. But they would not move the hearing to a different day, and they would not even move up the start time by 30 minutes so we could ask the Administrator Long our questions. So here's what I will do. I will take the questions we wanted to ask and submit them as official questions for the record. Administrator Long, I want answers to every one of these questions before the end of the year. When disaster strikes, the American people do not want politics. They simply want results. They do not want posturing. They want leadership. They do not want excuses. They want a nonpartisan, effective, and efficient response that saves lives. I guarantee you, Administrator Long, this hearing will not be your last before this committee. We want full compliance with every one of our previous requests. So, Mr. Chairman, I thank you, and I ask unanimous consent that Congressman Samblin, Gutierrez, and Velasquez be a part of this hearing.
Without objection. We're pleased to welcome the gentleman yields back, pleased to welcome our witnesses, the Honorable William B. Brock Long, Administrator for the Federal Emergency Management Agency, Major General Scott Spellman, Deputy Commanding General for Civil and Emergency Operations for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and Dr. Lynn Goldman, the Michael and Lori Milken Dean at the Milken Institute, School of Public Health, George Washington University. Welcome to each of you. Pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses must be sworn, so I would ask you to please stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God? May the record reflect the witnesses answered in the affirmative. You may take your seat. There's a lighting system that I'm sure you're familiar with to guide you. You have 5 minutes for your opening statement. Just understand that your entire opening statement was part of the record, and the members will read it. So to the extent you're able to do so, please limit your opening statement to 5 minutes. With that, Administrator Long.
Chairman Gowdy, Ranking Member Cummings, distinguished members of the committee, I'm here in the spirit of improvement. I'm here to discuss the way forward that FEMA is moving, as well as not just FEMA, but also the entire field of emergency management. I think it's important for me to tell you what a successful response and recovery looks like, because it involves a partnership. It involves the whole community. It's a lot more than just FEMA. If anybody's expecting that it's just FEMA who comes in and does the response and the recovery, they're mistaken. Emergency management is like a chair that's supported with 4 legs. One leg is the federal government. The second leg is the state and local governments. The third leg is the private sector and non-governmental organizations. And the fourth leg is the prepared citizenry that's properly insured, and it involves neighbor helping neighbor. When all 4 legs of those to that chair are present, then disaster response and recovery goes pretty well. We've seen that model take place in California, or as Congressman Ross said, in Florida. We've seen it take place in a lot of the communities, and that's the common denominator for the formula of success. That was not what was present going into Puerto Rico, unfortunately, and now I'm working every day to make sure that all 4 of those legs are a part of that chair. Because if one leg is missing, that chair becomes less stable. And we've got to do everything that we can to bolster state and local capability, private sector capability, and incorporate them into meaningful fashion into our plans, and that's what I'm doing. I'd also like to talk about the magnitude of the recent disasters and what my staff has been diligently working on and pushing forward. They're tremendous individuals, and they bust their rear ends for Americans every single day, and I'm proud of them. And let's talk about the magnitude of this. We have 514 open disasters across half this globe, from the Mariana Islands all the way to the Virgin Islands. We've seen 6 major landfall and hurricanes, 5 of the most historic wildfires in the last 15 months. That's on top of 75 declared total disasters last year, 68 this year, and we've also provided support to 113 wildfires. My staff has been busting their rear ends to help others. The average deployment of my staff is 136 days as they go out to take care of people and try to put people's lives back together. And I think that that should be recognized. I really do. This agency is doing everything that it can to push forward to help people before, during, and after disasters, but it goes back to what is a partnership in the whole community. The lessons learned, we need to do a lot of work with the private sector to understand survivable communications. We need to do everything we can to bolster state and local capability, but it's state legislators stepping up and funding their agencies properly and establishing rainy day funds. It's state and local governments that need to establish pre-event contracts to do commodities. We were able to mobilize over $2 billion worth of commodities to Puerto Rico specifically as a result of Hurricane Maria. The issue was not getting food, water, and resources to Puerto Rico. The issue was one of not being able to communicate where those should go. That's the problem we got to fix. Our after-action report is an open and honest assessment of the mistakes that were made and what we need to overcome, and I would ask people to take that into consideration. What are we doing? We've put together a whole community plan, a strategic plan that involves the whole community. We got 2,300 comments back from our constituents, and we arrived at 3 simple but very ambitious goals. Create a true culture of preparedness that does not exist in this country. People are underinsured. People can't put their hands on $500 to buy the insurance, which makes FEMA's role greater and increasing exponentially. We have put forward more individual assistance in the last 16 months than the agency has done in the 10 years previous combined. We actually have responded and put more assistance forward in the last 16 months than the agency did in the last 38 years combined. 38 years have been packed into the last 16 months, and my agency never gets enough credit for it. And I'm asking for your help, because laws need to change on the way we do disaster recovery housing. We need to have oversight and accountability not only of FEMA, but also of what's going on at the state and local level. There's 9 states that don't have a rainy day fund in this country. What are we doing about it to make sure that they have their own baseline capability to handle disasters? If you're expecting FEMA to be the only responder and the first responder for all these events, well, then you're going to have to quadruple my budget and increase my staffing patterns tremendously. But I don't think that's the way forward. I don't think that a bigger FEMA is the answer here. So I'm here today, humbly, to talk about the way forward. Place blame on me all you want. That's fine. I can take it. But that's not going to be the answer to solving the problems of the future. And what I'm asking for is a diplomatic opportunity to do so. And I need your support to do it. And I'm happy to provide all the information you need or all the ideas to do this right. Thank you.
Major General Spellman.
Thank you, and good morning. Chairman Gowdy, Ranking Member Cummings, and distinguished members of the committee, I'm honored to testify before you today to discuss the authorities and responsibilities of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers during disaster response and recovery operations, our lessons learned from the 2017 storm season, and actions we have taken to improve our performance during this last 2018 season. Again, my name is Major General Scott Spellman. I'm the Corps' Deputy Commanding General for Civil and Emergency Operations. I've been in position since June of this year. Previous to this assignment, I served as a Division Commander for the Corps' Northwestern Division. The Corps conducts its emergency response and recovery activities under 2 basic authorities, the Stafford Act and Public Law 8499. Under the Stafford Act and the National Response Framework, the Corps works under the direction of FEMA, serving as a lead federal coordinating agency for Emergency Support Function Number 3, which is Public Works and Engineering. Public Law 8499 provides a separate source of authority for the Corps to prepare for and respond to floods, hurricanes, and other natural disasters. Under these authorities, the Corps maintains 50 specially trained response teams supported by emergency and pre-awarded contracts to perform a wide array of public works and engineering missions. The 2017 hurricane season was historic in its scale, and we continue to identify and apply lessons learned to sustain and improve our performance. The extraordinary impacts of Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria resulted in an unprecedented response. For Hurricane Harvey, FEMA issued the Corps 29 mission assignments totaling $142 million. Nearly 1,000 Corps personnel deployed, and 15 employees remain engaged today supporting 6 active recovery mission assignments. In response to Hurricanes Irma and Maria, FEMA issued the Corps 55 mission assignments totaling $4.1 billion for Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. We again deployed thousands of personnel, and over 200 employees remain engaged today executing those recovery operations. Additionally, we received 32 mission assignments for the states of Florida and Georgia, totaling about $131 million. So detailed in my written testimony, these mission assignments encompassed a range of activities, including the removal of debris, installation of generators to provide emergency power, and the construction of temporary blue roofs, which enable impacted residents to move out of emergency shelters and back into their homes. Also in response to Hurricane Irma and Maria, the Corps was tasked to assist in the repair of segments of the Puerto Rico power grid. A collaboration of responders, including the Corps, other federal agencies, the utility industry, and the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority, have now restored power to all pre-storm customers, either through grid power or other long-term solutions. Including these 3 major hurricanes, the Corps responded to a total of 32 events in 2017. Among these other events were the October 2017 wildfires in Northern California, the Central U.S. blizzard, the Bighorn River ice jam in Wyoming, and numerous other flooding and severe weather events. The Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018 appropriated over $17.4 billion for the Corps to accomplish 3 broad tasks: to repair and rehabilitate existing projects across the nation that were damaged by these natural disasters, to construct new flood and storm damage reduction projects, and to complete flood and coastal storm damage reduction studies. We recently identified over 250 project studies that will receive these funds, and we're working as quickly as possible to complete these projects. And we also applied the lessons learned and best practices from 2017 in our preparation for and execution of the 2018 season. We completed several hurricane exercises along with our federal partners for the Gulf and East Coast, the Mississippi River Valley, as well as for Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. We participated in FEMA's 2018 intergovernmental and private sector national level exercise, and we have updated our hurricane plans, annexes, and standard operating procedures. We've also worked with FEMA to update and refine 34 pre-scripted mission assignments which speed the pace of our project delivery. These actions have enabled improved performance in the 28 disasters we have responded to in 2018 to date. Now, in addition to our involvement in these and future response and recovery missions, the Corps remains fully committed, focused, and capable of executing our other civil works activities across the nation. And ladies and gentlemen, this concludes my testimony, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you. Dr. Goldman.
Thank you so much, Chairman Gowdy, Ranking Member Cummins. It's an honor to testify today for this hearing. As you know, I'm the Dean of the Milken Institute School of Public Health at the George Washington University, and we conducted a recent study about the excess mortality in Puerto Rico from Hurricane Maria. I submit for the record my full testimony as well as the executive summary of our report for Puerto Rico. Using sophisticated models that account for migration, annual and seasonal variability in death rates, and adjustments for demographics like age, sex, and social class, we found that there were 2,975 excess lives lost due to Hurricane Maria for the 6-month study period of September 2017 through February 2018. All regions, social strata, and age groups on Puerto Rico were affected, but those living in municipalities with the lowest socioeconomic development, older adults, especially males, experienced the greatest risk of excess mortality. The 2 highest risk groups continued to have excess mortality through February 2018. Like all of the U.S., the physicians in Puerto Rico do not have the correct guidance to complete death certificates to relate deaths to hurricanes and other natural disasters. But we didn't find that the hurricane affected the quality or the completeness of the death certificates although it did create some delays in some of the records. We did find in our study that Puerto Rico lacked adequate plans and staffing for crisis and emergency risk communications, and likewise that the communities on Puerto Rico were not adequately prepared for a catastrophic hurricane. What we learned is that people felt that they were prepared for a Category 1 or a 2 storm, but not for a 4 or 5 storm. Regarding hurricane-related mortality, there was inconsistent information provided to the public by the government of Puerto Rico, as well as information gaps. These may have been the result of delays in information exchange because there were telecommunication failures, inconsistent disaster spokesperson training, no protocol for interagency coordination of mortality reporting, and ineffective strategies for rumor control. Clearly, Puerto Rico was quite vulnerable in terms of electrical and transportation systems that were not resilient and broke down for weeks to months after the storm. In many cases, great exertions were required to provide basic needs like food, water, shelter, and healthcare services. Those involved in the response and recovery efforts, both in the federal government and in the government of Puerto Rico, appeared to us to be competent and capable. But the storm impacted all on Puerto Rico, including the responders, the doctors, everybody was impacted personally. None of the responders could make up for the lack of prior planning and preparation. We have observed this problem again and again with other hurricanes as well, like Katrina, Ike, Sandy, Irma, and even Harvey. When communities are not prepared, they cannot create a response on the fly. These problems did not evolve overnight. We need to change from a culture of disaster and response to a culture of preparedness and resilience. Across coastal areas, we must take steps to protect medical facilities, make power grids more resilient, and make plans to evacuate people, especially the most vulnerable, from the riskiest areas. Individuals and communities need help to become more resilient and self-reliant for longer periods of time. They need to be prepared to do immediate rescue, a la the so-called Cajun Navy in Houston. We also can harness the capacity of the private sector and community organizations to provide assistance even before outsiders can arrive. Outside help from FEMA, but also the Public Health Service and the military is needed to restore the basic functions of society after a major storm like Maria. We plan to do more research about the impacts on Puerto Rico to better understand the causes of excess lives lost and ways we could prevent such deaths in the future, to identify other health impacts like mortality, like morbidity and disability, and to find better ways to prepare the communities in Puerto Rico so they can work together in a coordinated fashion in the future. We would like to see improvements in federal guidelines and training for death certification, as well as strengthening of public health systems. Finally, although we do not yet know the precise causes of all of the excess lives lost, it is clear that all efforts need to target resources to the elderly and those in lower income areas, both immediately after a major hurricane and in the months to follow. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Goldman. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield my time to Mr. Cloud from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Massey. Thank you, Chairman, for holding this committee meeting. It's certainly an extremely important topic on the federal disaster and recovery response, including the 2017 hurricane season. I have the honor of representing the 13 counties along the Texas Gulf Coast, going from Bay City down to Nueces County, which includes Corpus Christi. Of course, as you know, Hurricane Harvey made landfall in my district at Rockport, Texas. And I do want to thank you, first of all, for the work that you've been doing to help us recover. Over the last few months, we've been able to, a number of grants have come through, and it's really helping our district recover. Of course, each disaster affords us the opportunity to evaluate, and that's what this is about, and I appreciate your comments at the beginning, even in being proactive in a number of things. Wanted to kind of tell you what I've been hearing as I've traveled the district. Of course, the topics are broad. I've tried to put them into 3 buckets that seem to be reoccurring. Of course, each of them are interconnected and related, but housing has been an issue. Staffing with FEMA has been an issue, and then seemingly wasteful and complicated processes. I know that you're working internally to see what you can do about that. I'm also interested to hear what you're doing internally, but also what we need to do as a legislative body to reform Stafford and free up your hands to do what needs to be done. Also recognize that this is a team effort. It requires communities being involved. I think one of the successes we've seen while the process of recovery is ongoing in Texas has been the initiative that the people of Texas and communities and people across the country who've come and helped to participate, neighbor helping neighbor, churches getting involved, communities being prepared and involved. Certainly there's a lot to be learned, but we're on the way to recovery because of some of those initiatives. Here's kind of what I hear when I'm touring and talking to people in our district. There is a lot to be learned. The processes are pretty complicated and long. If I were to, we had one school district map out the process, and if we were to lay it out across the table, they have 55 projects themselves they were trying to track, and so they created a map of it, and the process would fill up that table. It's that long. And what happens oftentimes, or what I've heard over and over a number of times, is you'll get to the end of the process, and there'll be, for example, a tree that's not supposed to be in the process, so it gets kicked back to the beginning, and then by the time it gets back to the final part, the staff has changed and they're reevaluating using different parameters to evaluate, and so there's something else wrong with it, and so it goes back to the beginning of the process, and so this adds a lot of time. It adds a lot of waste, both internally for FEMA and to the people trying to recover. I think it's important to remember that these people, as they're trying to recover, first of all, they already had a job. Second of all, they had the new job of trying to fix their own house. I think of in Refugio, the superintendent, 80 to 90% of their kids were considered homeless. So was the superintendent. Her husband, who's the sheriff, was also homeless, and the sheriff's department had been displaced. So on top of that, they're trying to learn what is this new full-time job of FEMA recovery and mastering these processes. So that's the context that this is in. And so recurring staff was a big issue. I'm wondering, one of the other issues that we heard when it came to housing, for example, was the issue of FEMA being able to share information with local governments. For example, FEMA goes in, they survey the area, they find out who the homeless were, local entities, county governments, state governments are trying to help solve the problem and could not get the information. They would be asked how many homeless people we have, and we're like, we don't know. We know FEMA knows, but they can't or won't tell us. We know FEMA is designed to operate on a federalist model. What kind of information does FEMA share with local government entities? Is there anything we need to do to make that process better?
Congressman, thank you for the question. This could take a while to answer. Let's just start with housing. I can't think of one disaster recovery housing mission in the history of FEMA that is lifted up as the gold standard. And here's the problem. I need more granting authority, not me. FEMA needs more granting authority to block grant funding down to a governor so that a governor can do housing the way he or she thinks that it would work best in his or her community, not how FEMA thinks it works best. We tried something novel and innovative in the state of Texas with Governor Abbott, and I applaud his bravery for stepping up and the General Land Office for stepping up, because just dragging in FEMA manufactured homes or travel trailers is incredibly expensive. And there are some studies that suggest that one trailer, by the time you buy it, haul it, install it, get the permitting for it, landlord over it for 18 months, then dispose of it properly, haul it off, could be anywhere between $200,000 and $300,000 for one manufactured home. Why are we not being able to block grant that money directly to the citizen to do home construction, to keep them in their house directly? So even if we set a limit, and what we tried to do was enter into an inter-service agreement, it was something innovative. It didn't work as well as I had hoped it would work, but you know what? Hit me for trying something different. We entered into this agreement, and basically we were able, if I remember correctly, to provide $60,000 to those homeowners that wanted to take that option to do that direct construction. Imagine how much money we saved if we had to bring in those manufactured homes by doing that, and we kept those folks in their house. We've got to figure out more granting authority and become a block granting agency to push the money down to the GLO or to the governors to be able to do housing the way that they want to do it. Disaster recovery housing is totally broken because it's solely on my shoulders. There's no whole community effort in disaster housing. And if a governor like Governor Abbott has to follow my big, bulky, bureaucratic recovery 2 CFR laws when it comes to doing housing, then it's never going to move that quick. Help me. Get rid of the complexity. That's goal number 3 in our strategic plan. I can tell you how to do that. You know, we're always looking to streamline. The other problem with disaster recovery is there's this myth that FEMA is the only agency that does and provides disaster recovery dollars in a disaster. I believe that there's about 17 different agency pots of money that comes down from the whole host of the federal government. And what we've never done is trained mayors, procurement officers, financial officers at the local level, or emergency managers on true disaster cost recovery. FEMA has to graduate from this myth that we're a lights and sirens type agency. You know what we do? We're disaster financial recovery managers. It's my job to come in and say, Governor, here's what you're entitled to. Here's how the money comes from all these different agencies, FEMA, HUD, SBA, whatever it is. Here's how to use it in succession to do the greatest good. But there's not one computer model that I can provide anybody that says, if you spend the money this way, we will become resilient, and we will never have to come back into your communities in Texas to do this again, because we've used this money correctly and we factored in mitigation and we did it right. That's the problem. How do you streamline this? There's too much of a time delay between FEMA's emergency housing and where HUD CDBG-DR funding can be used. It's complicated. It creates mistakes. It's far greater than FEMA streamlining its processes. It's how do we do this in a block grant format and allow governors to control their own destiny? Take me out of the game.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Administrator Long, I've listened to you very carefully. And first of all, I want to clear up some things here. There is no one on this committee that does not fully appreciate what FEMA has done. And we realize that FEMA has a tremendous burden on its hands, particularly with, I know some people don't believe in science, but with climate change and what we're seeing in this world and our nation. But it's not so much, you know, I heard what you said, but a lot of this is about we take the dollars that we have and then we use them effectively and efficiently. One of the things that we're committed here is with, dealing with waste, fraud, and abuse. And I think you will agree with me that the issue that I raised about the meals, somebody did something wrong, and that was a waste of our dollars. But I want to come back. I just want to make sure you don't get that confused.
I'd like an opportunity to answer a question on the
briefly,
tribute
because I've got to go and vote.
There's misinformation. There's misinformation on that tribute contract.
Okay.
FEMA paid for $50,000 worth of meals from that vendor. And the bottom line is we put forward $225,000. That $156 million limit was a cap. Mm-hmm. We never wasted $156 million. As a matter of fact, we spent $225,000, if I remember correctly, for 50,000 meals. We canceled the contract because we put redundancy in all of our contracts. There's more than just one food vendor. We have multitude of pre-event contracts that we've expanded, and so there's a lot of misinformation in the alleged accusations like that.
I have some questions on that I'll send to you, but I want to ask you about some things that really concern me. George Washington University released an independent study this summer that put the death count in Puerto Rico from Hurricane Maria at 2,975 American deaths. This is devastating and raises many questions. Dr. Goldman, I'm coming right back to you, sir, but Dr. Goldman, can you explain how your researchers reached their conclusion briefly?
Well, briefly, it was a statistical effort that involved looking at the patterns of death over the 10 years prior to the storm within that season of the year, adjusting for age and sex and the very sharp demographic changes that have been occurring on the island, to say in sum total that there were 2,975 more than would have been expected in a year that did not have the hurricane.
A couple of months ago, our committee obtained alarming documents from the Department of Defense regarding the uncovering, and listen to this, the uncovering of mass graves in the immediate days after Hurricane Maria on September 29, 2017. One of these emails state, and I quote, "We are finding mass graves in mudslide areas," end of quote. Later in this email chain, it says, "It is not clear if these mass graves were families or, quote, an entire town," unquote. Administrator Long, were you aware of these mass graves?
I'm not aware of the mass graves, no.
Did you or anyone else brief the President or the White House? So you never knew about them?
I'm not aware of any mass.
Is this the first time you've heard this?
I'm not aware of any mass graves, no.
Do you know how many people died?
No, so let me be clear. One death is a death too many. This agency works every day to try to prevent loss of life and suffering after a disaster, so bear with me. Bottom line is, these studies, there's not a clear delineation of direct deaths or indirect deaths. FEMA has to take the word of the local county coroner or a medical examiner to determine what the cause of death was or whatever. We're not outfitted to determine what the death cause was. For every disaster in the history of disasters, there are direct deaths of wind, water, whatever it may be, the elements of the disaster that kills somebody. And then there's indirect deaths after the fact where people die in car wrecks because the stoplights are out, the power's not on, whatever it may be. They fall off their house trying to fix their roof. They have heart attacks trying to remove debris off their land. And that's well documented. The bottom line is what we have to do is have a very solid discussion, particularly around Puerto Rico, of how we prevent this from happening again. And you know what? The single greatest factor for the formula of success going forward is power. Who needs to be sitting here? PREPA needs to be sitting here. And when it comes to the VA case, I'll use your example on VA case as an example of why PREPA needs to be sitting here. You know who's providing power to VA case right now? FEMA and the Army Corps of Engineers, not PREPA. So what are they doing about it? Are they prepared to rebuild a power grid for the future that is more resilient, that helps all of the infrastructure be strong, resilient, economically viable, or whatever it is? That's who needs to be sitting here and answering questions, because I have a very, very low confidence level that PREPA is ready to rebuild the power grid to make sure that the infrastructure stands up so that people don't die a long time after the fact when the power's out.
Well,
I don't know how many people died in Puerto Rico, but one death is a death too many.
I heard you, but I'm going to get to you the information that I just talked about, because I didn't know that you were unaware of it, about these mass graves. And I want you to, and then I'll have some questions for you on that. We also have another email chain showing that more than 2 months after Hurricane Maria, individuals on the Puerto Rican island of Vieques were still living in dire conditions. You just mentioned that. The email is a cry for help. Listen to what they said. We have limited to no communications. We are unable to rebuild physical infrastructure. Our gas lines are in excess of 6 hours at times due to inconsistent delivery. The email went to Michael Byrne, who was FEMA's lead official in Puerto Rico, and then the same email was forwarded to you. Administrator Long, do you remember receiving this email when it came to you in November 2017?
Actually, it wasn't just that email. There were hundreds of emails very similar to that from VA case and Calabria.
So do you remember that one?
Yeah, right. So, well, not that one specifically. What I'm saying is there were 400 emails a day coming to me on Puerto Rico in some cases. You know, so the bottom line is I'm very aware of the problem, but I'll go back to asking the question again. We're currently on VA case We've rebuilt temporary medical facilities and supplies. We're the ones running emergency generator power on VA case. The question that this committee needs to ask is, what is PREPA's plan and the Commonwealth plan to serve their citizens on VA case, not just FEMA's? Because I don't have the authority, nor do I want the authority, to do the permanent work to rebuild the power grid for the future. That is up to the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico and to PREPA, and I'm here to tell you, if we want to prevent deaths in the future, if we want to make sure that the infrastructure is maintained, then I would strongly suggest that the committee call them to understand what their plan is going forward and how they're going to use billions of dollars of tax-paying money to rebuild the power grid and the infrastructure for the future. If you recall, I had to ask for special authorities to fix all of the deferred maintenance of the infrastructure. And I should have never been placed, or FEMA should have never been placed in that situation to begin with. That doesn't happen across the rest of the globe. So here again,
Well, okay.
here again,
Sir,
hit FEMA, hit FEMA. But going forward, the real question, if we truly care about what the future of Puerto Rico is, I'm telling you, we have got to understand how the Power Authority is prepared or capable, or even if they're even capable, of rebuilding the grids and the infrastructure that needs to be in place to be more resilient.
Administrator Long, let me be clear with you. What I'm saying to you is, I think we all are about being effective and efficient, sir. I mean, and so people died, and we are all, like you said, one death is one too many. And we're trying to figure out, just like you, how we deal with this in a way where we can prevent that in the future. And so that's why I'm getting into these questions. I'm not here to beat up on you, just trying to figure out what happened so we can correct it, because life is short. But one last thing, Mr. Chairman, I know you have great indulgence. But our staff has been asking FEMA about this email that I just talked about for quite a while. And we asked who sent it and what you did after receiving it, but we've received no response. Do you know who sent the original email on this email that I'm talking about?
The question, I don't
know.
Here again,
Okay.
I actually got to the point where my email was being bombarded, mostly by campaigns where I was receiving hundreds of emails a day, to the point that it would actually block me from being able to get the operational emails that I needed to receive. So that was the case. But when it comes to the documentation request, please understand that, I expect my staff to be very responsive when it comes to any inquiry that this committee or any other committee would put forward. But we have been through such a tremendous time in the last 16 months that
and you know
staff
what?
is somewhat overwhelmed.
And you know what?
Yeah.
Sadly, we're going to go through some more difficult times.
Sure.
And so all I'm saying to you is that I'd like to get the documentation, and I promise you that we'll have you back in January, and we can talk about this some more. But the American people want us to solve their problems, and I know you want to do that too. I have no doubt about that. And all I'm saying to you is that we need information to do our job, and we're going to look into this issue in a very responsible way, not attack thing, but trying to come up with solutions, okay?
And I am here to help. Trust me, nobody in this building.
And I'm sorry I've got to leave, but I've got to go to vote in a minute.
Thank you for your question, sir. We're here to help.
Thank you.
Gentleman from Maryland yields back. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Long, thank you for doing a thankless job. We know that there are bureaucratic walls up there preventing you from doing what you know needs to be done, and we really do want to help you. And to that end, Representative Ann Wagner had just recently passed out a bill out of Financial Service Committee, of which I also serve, that would reform the CDBG housing block, the grants, the way you have identified. Hopefully we can get that to the House hopefully we can get it to the Senate, and hopefully we can make it into law, because that is such a crucial issue. Since 2004, I have been intimately involved in disaster recovery, relief, and preparedness. And when I chaired the House Insurance Committee in the state of Florida in 2004 to 2006, we had successive hurricanes come right through. In 60 days, 3 named storms come right through my county. We learned a lot about that. We also learned that we can't solely rely on FEMA. I agree with you on your 4 legs of that stool. The state of Florida, we have the Florida Hurricane Catastrophe Fund, which is financed partly by percentage of premiums and also by reinsurance instruments. There is a taxpayer backstop to it, but it's very far back there. But it also provides liquidity in order to provide funds, in order to rebuild, in order to pay the claims necessary. We also saw the private sector, for example, public supermarkets, created warehousing in various regions in anticipation of storms where they had stored relief items, water, food, generators, things of that nature, so that we could then logistically distribute them in a very quick and fashionable way to get people back in. We saw Louisiana, as a result of Katrina, lose a congressional seat because of the devastating storms, and you weren't prepared. We were not prepared to have them stay there. They lost more than their homes. They lost their lifestyle as well as their jobs. What I'm getting at is that you hit upon things where we as a Congress should face reality that every year we're going to have natural disasters occur, and yet we don't put it as a line item in our budgets. We don't appropriate, and we have to go through a process where it took 6 months for Hurricane Irma relief to hit my state of Florida, which was way too late. And when in addition to that, we had things attached to that relief that probably were not even anywhere related to the hurricane. We should have the foresight to have a line item budget, and we should also be able to cede some of that risk. And one of the things I want to ask you about is risk transfer agreements. I have a bill out there called the Disaster Assistance Risk Transfer Act, DART Act. It would allow FEMA, which you've done recently, to cede some of that liability to the private markets. Now, the reinsurance markets right now have adequate capacity and can do that so that not only are you not having to come to us for disaster relief, but you can immediately respond with liquidity and dollars in order to meet the needs. So I'd love for you to comment on our ability to be able to expand your capability to get that capacity.
Absolutely. I think reinsurance is the key to fixing a lot of problems, particularly the NFIP as well as maybe the Disaster Relief Fund.
I mean, we're not in the business of being in insurance. We're not in the business of building cars. We are in the business of administering good lives and in the parameters of good business. We should allow those who do it best, such as the insurance markets, to provide that relief so that you have what's necessary to do your job.
So can I also add, you know, one of the most expensive expenditures out of FEMA, the most expensive expenditure, and this is crazy to me, it's actually a moral hazard in my opinion. We pay to fix uninsured public facilities and contents for cities who are self-insured.
Yeah.
That's our most expensive expenditure. That is tax-paying dollars rebuilding schools,
incentivizing the rebuilding of
government
schools
facilities.
In high-risk areas.
Yep, and the private insurance industry, I would argue, would be willing to pick that up, and it would alleviate the amount of money that we have to put out and the amount of work that we have to put out in recovery. I think we saved taxpayers also, by the way, during Harvey, about $1 billion in reinsurance on the National Floodplain Insurance Program.
I agree, and I thank you for that, because risk management is something they do well. They manage that capital well to the benefit of the insured, the consumers.
Right.
One other thing I'd like to touch base on is we saw, as a result of Hurricane Andrew in the early 90s and then our successive storms thereafter, that we have the science to build resilient structures. That our housing stock that was lost was not built under the new building codes that the state of Florida imposed. As a result of those building codes, we have some of the strongest structures available. We also created, unfortunately we didn't fund it long enough, but a mitigation program, because we realized that for every $1 spent in mitigation, in hardening those structures, we save $4 in relief. What could you comment on how we can best, and I can't count on the federal government to do this resiliency investment. We need our states. We need our local governments.
Yep. So first of all, I think the key to resiliency, regardless of what causes disasters, whether it's a changing climate or, you know, whatever it may be, The key to reducing disaster impacts is local building codes, land use planning, zoning, and then comprehensive mitigation strategies. Now, what I'm very thankful for is the passage of the Disaster Recovery Reform Act. For those that sponsored, pushed that bill forward and voted for it, it is transformational. What it does is it propels pre-disaster mitigation funding to the forefront, because I have been complaining since day one that disaster mitigation is a regressive process traditionally, but now what you've done with the passage of that bill is it basically says that 6% of all the disaster dollars that we spend in any given disaster year will be put up front in pre-disaster mitigation. But here's the thing. Here's what I have to fix in every disaster. We've come up with 7 critical lifelines, and when it comes to the infrastructure, we always have to make sure that power and fuel works, communications works, the hospitals work. So there's a whole multitude of things that have to work. So why are we not collectively doing what we can to mitigate those 7 critical lifelines so that we can get better and better and reduce the response in the future, rather than continuing this business practice that we cannot afford to continue doing? But if you want to save money to the taxpayer, I think that you have to form strong partnerships with the insurance industry and look at Category E public assistance, and why is FEMA having to pay for and fix uninsured public properties and contents. I think you will save billions of dollars over the next decade if you start to take a look at that. And what we have to do is we have to increase the cost share to make it more expensive to pay the cost share for fixing your uninsured public facility than it would be to get an insurance plan.
Thank you. I see my time's expired. Even though I'm leaving Congress, I will tell you that I will continue to be an advocate for both the risk transfer agreements as well as strong investment in mitigation and resiliency. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman.
Gentleman from Florida yields back. The gentlelady from the Virgin Islands is recognized.
I'm just trying to pull myself together when I hear conversations like this. Because when you start off saying that a lot of this should be the states' right, the states or the territories, that you should increase insurance and, you're concerned about paying cost share for insurance, when this is the same body that underfunds the territories to begin with, that puts arbitrary caps on Medicaid, puts arbitrary caps, defunds us in terms of the amount of funding that we receive in transportation costs in other areas. And then when a disaster strikes and we're unable to meet those costs, it becomes a question of why aren't we being responsible about our stuff? It just freaking drives me crazy. And I'm just trying to pull myself together to ask the questions that I know I'm supposed to ask of you that are related to the issue that's at hand. When Congress is more concerned with imposing on the territories restrictions on cockfighting and roosters, but don't give a damn about the children or the seniors in those areas and their costs and their needs and their rights, that just incenses me that this body acts that way. Mr. Long, you said that there's concern about the cost shares. One of the questions I wanted to ask you was why FEMA has not decided to exercise its clear authority under the Insular Area Acts to waive non-federal cost share for public assistance permanent work in the Virgin Islands, such as under Category F, which are the utility costs, that the Insular Areas Act does authorize you to be able to do. When you have areas like the territories that have been underfunded in these other areas, you know that there are budget issues that they have, and they're unable to meet those cost shares.
So a large portion was funded at 100% initially. Right now, the cost share is at 90-10, if I remember correctly, and that is above and beyond the 75-25. The question that we have, and it's also my understanding that we are reviewing a request from the U.S. Virgin Islands right now to go through, and we will methodically look at that and try to make the best decision that we can. But often when it comes to the offset of that 10% that they have to look at, there's ways of utilizing or accounting for voluntary management organizations that have provided in-kind match that will reduce. And then also when HUD CDBG-DR funding comes into play, a lot of that money can actually be used to offset the match as well. So we, and traditionally, when the president grants 100%, it's typically when there is still emergency work, life safety work that takes place, and all of this comes into account. Not only that, but how much money does the Virgin Islands or Puerto Rico or Texas, whatever they have.
And what is the determinant of life-saving work, considering that our mobile hospitals still are not up, our dialysis patients are still away? How does that work?
Fair question. So there's two types of work that we do, emergency work and permanent work. And once we basically have come to a conclusion on the emergency work that's being done and we transition into the permanent work, that's where the cost share comes in. And if there's not even the slightest bit of cost share, from where I sit, when there's a cost share involved, that means there's also skin in the game, which helps us all focus on what's the most important way of going forward in recovery. And that's just the truth. When it comes to how do you focus, if you have a little bit of money to put forward, then it helps us to fine-tune what are the true goals of the Virgin Islands, Florida, California, or whatever it may be, you know, any state that's going through this to focus where they are. But we are evaluating the cost share ask as we speak. And we take this very seriously.
So when you talked about that, we talked, I know there was a GAO report that talked about the disaster, particularly in terms of housing recovery. Mm-hmm. You know, that's been a major issue in the Virgin Islands with the number of homes that have been destroyed. Army Corps of Engineers came in. The blue tarp was slow in its processing. They've now moved to in-house permanent sheltering in place, which is beginning to work. At what point will FEMA reconsider the use of Disaster Housing Assistance Program, DHAP, like what was put in place after Hurricane Katrina to respond to the needs of displaced households? Mm-hmm. And what factors or criteria will promote a change in that position?
So there's a misunderstanding about DHAP. DHAP was the traditional housing program that we would use to help some of those that were misplaced. But after Sandy occurred, the Sandy Improvement Act gave FEMA new authorities to do what's called direct lease. So basically, we have now been given the authority as a result of going through Sandy to do the same thing that DHAP basically accomplishes. It's a duplicative program for the most part. And in many cases, if a person does not qualify for our housing assistance under the direct lease program, then most likely they're not going to also qualify for the DHAP program. So a lot of this is just based around misinformation, but also, more importantly, new tools in my toolbox that you have provided to me from Congress, which is good.
Okay, and just some administrative things, because I know my time has run out. I have, Mr. Chair, several statements from residents and other individuals of the Virgin Islands, observations on the federal response to Maria in Puerto Rico submitted by Jeffrey A. Parks, as well as a statement for the record from Megan Enright, a resident of St. John. I ask that those be submitted.
Without objection.
Thank you. And also, sir, I wanted to know, Mr. Long, if I could receive the weekly recovery status reports that you have. Do you have copies of that my office can receive starting from, what are we in now? In December? So could we get several months going back of those? There's some clear questions as to what are the projects that are most important that our governor has outlined, that his work has outlined. And I do believe that you all have the best interest in mind. And, you know, the shifting of blame between local government and federal government has got to end. People have got to man up, woman up, and take responsibility for their shortcomings. I know that the GAO, you were willing to listen to what they said in terms with regard to you. I'd like our own local government to do that and see where the people of the Virgin Islands to see where those gaps are.
Sure, yes, ma'am. We'd be happy to provide
Thank you.
Reports. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back.
Oh, I'm sorry, sir, with your indulgence. And may I also submit for the record, the local Senator Janelle Sorrow also gave a testimony at our congressional field hearing on her observations and issues that she saw between the local and federal government with regard to the recovery.
Without objection.
Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Texas is recognized for his own time, Mr. Cloud.
Thank you. Kind of picking up where we left off, one of the issues we were talking about was housing. I appreciated you mentioning the trailers. We had conversations about that offline, about the amazing cost of it. One of the other issues that was kind of complicating was the FEMA staff that would be deployed would often take up the available temporary housing that residents could use for recovery. My question is, meanwhile, trailers are sitting on an airstrip waiting for the approval process to be placed where they could, with residents who need recovery. So has FEMA considered using those trailers to house its own employees? freeing up the temporary housing space to allow residents back into their communities. Many would have to stay at hotels 2 hours away because the local ones were taken up by FEMA employees and then not available to help with their own recovery process.
Yep, and that's a very fair and great question. It's something that we have to balance very delicately. The last thing that I want to do is have my response staff taking up rooms that we're also trying to utilize through our transitional shelters capabilities. And so we want to be able to access those hotels for disaster victims or disaster survivors. And what we try to do is set up base camps. We try to, for our own responders, but it always takes us a couple days to get our feet underneath us when we respond. The second part, when it comes to utilizing trailers, here again, we're having to stage trailers all over the country right now because of what's gone on in Paradise or what's gone on in Michael and still, the issues that are coming in Texas. The biggest thing that stands in the way of us typically getting trailers put into place is local permitting and ordinances like the Not in My Backyard ordinances that actually delay us from being able to get it into the property. And then if you look at, Paradise, California, which is the worst disaster I've ever seen in my life, and all of you should take a trip over there and go see what the devastation was in California, is that there's nothing to hook a trailer up to. There's no supporting infrastructure whatsoever. And, housing is incredibly difficult. So I go back to what I think would be best is granting authority. If I could block grant that funding to Governor Abbott, and Governor Abbott could follow his own procurement laws to go buy every travel trailer that's in the state of Texas, that's the way the model should work, rather than me having to go through a large contract and purchasing manufactured housing units from some other, company located wherever. Governor Abbott ought to be able to go to all the lots in Texas that sell travel trailers and buy them at a market, competitive market rate. That's how it should work.
Thank you. We talked about the process, the length of the process. If I can just, as a visual aid, that's the FEMA process.
Yeah.
Very, very complicated. And in spite of what people are going through, I talked to someone in Smithville. They had 3 different site visits to the same site, each with teams of 7 people, each not aware of what the previous team had done. In Wharton, they had 7 site visits to the same river, each time with a different team. There was a $10,000 grant that one small community was applying for that had the same 32 approval touch points as someone applying for a $1 million grant. So my question really is, how can FEMA reform the process so that it's streamlined, but also so that there's a single point of contact and a single warehouse of information, so that, ideally staff wouldn't change, but when it does have to change, that they have access to what's been done to this point, because so many times it just felt like starting from scratch 8 months into the process.
Yep, so goal number 3 under reduce the complexity, what I think would be best is that if we submitted for the record what we're trying to do to reduce the burden in the process. If you go back to, I believe it was Harvey, and we need to go back and confirm the numbers, but I think as a result of Harvey, we had to physically perform 2.3 million home inspections. Why can't we just use technology? Well, here's why. Because if we use technology and we get something wrong, then I get hit with a negative OIG report.
Well,
and so we're having to strike the right balance.
To your point, there would be residents who had the forethought to think, before I start making my own home repairs, I'm going to take pictures of my house.
Right. Why can't I use satellite imagery
but
and aerial
because it
imagery?
Wasn't FEMA taken by a FEMA rep, those photos were not submissible.
Exactly.
As evidence.
And that's where FEMA wants to go. Trust me, we want to make things streamlined and cut down the time frame. But and I learned this. Harvey, I had been in office 2 months, and Harvey was my first real disaster of going through. And it blew my mind that it takes 17,000 people to go do 2.3 million home inspections. That's a ridiculous process. Do we not have technology, satellite imagery or aerial imagery, or, take the word of the citizen to be able to do it and rapidly approve it? Now, we get hit all the time because we're not protecting against fraud, but I would argue that fraud is the fraud that might be encountered is minimal compared to the contract it takes me to do the home inspections. So it's a balance, but then I'm caught in a rock and a hard place because if I don't protect against fraud, I'm dragged in front of a committee and told you're not protecting against fraud. So we have to strike the right balance, and I agree. That process is too long. We have to do what we can to cut forward. I'm not a fan of 2 CFR that guides how money is put forward. I think there's two different standards. There's a double standard for the federal government or the state governments and the local governments. And we need to go through that, fine-tune it, and streamline it and put money forward. I think after a disaster, everybody is trying to do the best that they can and to move as quickly as they can. And I know my agency is working on it.
It would seem to me that for all the best intentions of eliminating waste, that we've created a system of waste. I look forward to your report to see the specifics of how that's being done. I know my time is limited, so I'll submit further questions and to you and look forward to your response. But
thank you.
Appreciate
Trust
it.
me, we're after the same thing. We want to accomplish the same
No
thing
doubt. No doubt.
is streamline it.
Gentleman yields back. I ask unanimous consent that our friend from Louisiana, Mr. Graves, be allowed to fully participate in today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. Mr. Sablon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Gowdy, and of course, Ranking Member Cummings, for the opportunity to sit in with your committee for today's hearing. At the risk of overextending my invitation, I also ask that this committee continues its examination of how the federal government responds to disasters, and to include in that examination Typhoon Sodilor, Typhoon Mangkhut, and Super Typhoon Yutu, the largest storm on planet Earth this year, in its examinations. Thank you. The Northern Mariana Islands, my district was struck by Sodilor about 3 years ago, Typhoon Mangkhut, and on September 10 and October 24 by Super Typhoon Yutu. We're still and slowly recovering. We're Typhoon Alley, so we deal with many storms, several a year. But I want to take this moment to thank the American people for all that they're doing to help their fellow Americans in the Marianas rebuild their lives. I want to acknowledge the work that the 1,345 federal employees assigned to the Marianas are doing, including many from some Army Corps, many from FEMA, and other the Department of Defense personnel as well. Please know that I'm very grateful for their help. But I'm not satisfied with their work. How can I be when so many people I represent remain without power and water, living in shelters and tents? Many children, their children not in school, without jobs and income, struggling day by day. After going through a typhoon, I have gone over hundreds and hundreds of typhoons. I've never seen one like this. A gentleman whose roof flew when the eye was just passing by. He told me, he said, Congressman Sablon, I have never seen that the air around me and the clouds were color pink. That was the eye passing. But reading the committee's report on the federal response in other parts of the country, I see that I am not alone in my dissatisfaction. Let me explain something. In Typhoon Sodilor, about 3 years ago, a dialysis center came to me and asked me to help him find fuel for his generator so his 61 patients don't have to get up and be moved to Guam for their dialysis. In Typhoon Yutu, he came to me and asked for water. 61 patients that our hospital, the only other dialysis center, couldn't handle. But these are things that should have been already in some checkbox, you know. There's that dialysis center, let's check on him, how's he doing? But no, it's not. How do I explain to my constituent the slow pace of inspections of damaged properties? FEMA Deputy Administrator Bill Rhodes, Region 9, Mr. Long, committed to me on November 6th that 90% of inspections would be complete in 30 days. With only a week to go, only 51% of inspections are complete. I asked him when he told me that, I said, are you sure? And he said, yes, I pledge. I give you my pledge. And if I got written up for a conversation I had with one of your staff, and if FEMA would do its work as fast as they wrote me up, then I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you, Mr. Long. But then also, how do I explain to my constituents why inspectors have not called? FEMA told me that I could promise that they could get a call in 7 to 10 days after registration, and they did not. After the typhoon came, I had to go find a generator and open up a registration office in my congressional office and help people use the phone and register online. Because FEMA did not do that in the beginning. And it went on for, if I'm not mistaken, sir, up to 10 days. Once FEMA opened a registration office and helping people, I closed mine. But I had to do that because no one was doing anything except telling people, yeah, call this number and register. And some people don't have phones. Some people have phones are on prepaid phones. And I watched a lady sit down for 6 hours in my office, 6 hours, trying to navigate registering with her case with FEMA. But I'll be honest with you also, I watch people get done in 10 minutes. And I come from a place where people are asked, what's your bank routing number? And they said, what the hell is that? So do you know your bank routing number, Mr. Long? I don't. See, so
the gentleman's out of time, but if you
may
would,
I just have another minute? May I please, Mr. Chairman? Please.
I'll give you one more to go along with
Thank
the one
you.
I've already given you.
Thank you, sir. And again, you know, Mr. Long, I'm not holding this against you, but how do I explain to my constituents why FEMA send inspection notices or payments to the physical location of damaged homes instead of to post office boxes? There's no home delivery in the Marianas, so the mail piled up at the post office, undeliverable because they were addressed to the second blue house from the corner, and then returned to the sender, either FEMA or Treasury, for the benefit checks. All of these things. And, you know, again, I got attached to FEMA, I think, reservist. And when I'm talking to him, and how do I get answers to these questions? You know, when FEMA staff assigned to the congressional liaison on the ground never know. I get so tired of hearing, I don't know, Congressman. I'm asking him a question and he's using his phone. I'm serious. I don't, okay. This goes on. Yeah. And he says we can't meet till 11 o'clock because he has 2 updates in the morning to meet. And he cannot answer my question. Every question I ask is, I don't know. The next person that talks to me, every question I ask is, I will have to ask and get back to you. I can understand that.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
The gentleman's extra minute is up, but if you would like to respond,
Congressman, first of all, the Mariana Islands took a tremendous hit. You're exactly right. Typhoon U2. We have over 1,200 federal government employees out there responding now. And it's my understanding that we put roughly $3 million in the hands of those who have registered and were eligible for assistance, yes, with individual assistance. Here's the problem, and this goes back to my original opening statement. We have got to call. It's hard for us when the communication system is totally knocked out. You know, a lot of our registration system is dependent upon whether it's phones, you know, cell phones or the internet, and then being able to mobilize several thousand miles away disaster support teams to manually register people door to door is a painstaking process. So here's the thing. What I would ask of Congress is, how do we work with the private sector, the Verizons, the telecoms, you know, the AT&Ts of the world to make sure that they are putting forward a resilient infrastructure that we need to use to communicate that doesn't get blown out by storms or burned up by wildfires?
Because when that stuff happens, it impacts my ability to do jobs, and it frustrates us, it frustrates you. Yeah. In regards to the information request, I need to go back and ask Bill Roche why you're not getting the answers, and what I'm going to do is put my regional administrator, Bob Finn, directly in touch with you as a result of this hearing today, and we'll try to clear up any
thank you, Mr. Long. Mr. Long, I need to work with you because this thing is going to take a while. And on the telephone system, Mr. Long, it's underground. We have a better phone system than Hawaii. I mean, when the typhoon is hit, I keep calling my mother if she's okay. So that's not a problem. It's just that people don't have phones and they don't have the money to pay for long-distance calls. I mean, toll-free numbers. I'd really like, if possible, for someone in your office to come visit so we can talk.
Absolutely.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence. I'm grateful.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Heiss, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Administrator Long, thank you so much for being here and for your leadership, what you're bringing to the agency. As we've all seen in recent months, it seems now more than ever, the role that you play is a critical one, and we appreciate the leadership you're providing. I recently, of course, have been impacted by Hurricane Michael. Came through Georgia and through portions of my district were hit hard. We also have family who live in the panhandle of Florida who were directly in the eye of that storm. One family member totally lost their home. Another is severely damaged. They're working through it, and others are surviving and just doing some cases, thankfully, minimal repairs. But in that whole process, I personally went to the panhandle of Florida and obviously some counties in Georgia as well. But because family personally involved, we were on the scene with family, taking supplies and helping generators, that type of thing. And I want to say that the word that I received working directly with people and being right in the middle of that catastrophic event were people who told me that within hours of the storm, FEMA had boots on the ground, doing everything from passing out water to helping clear the roads. And I just want to say personally thank you for the role there. And I'm sure that FEMA was not the only one. I'm sure there was state and local government as well as non-government entities and certainly citizens involved immediately. But I want to thank you for the quick response that FEMA provided there. And with that, of course, Georgia has been powerfully impacted in recent years by a couple of storms. And I, again, want to thank you and your team for working closely with our governor and the incredible work that GEMA does, the Georgia Emergency Management Association. But can you walk me through right now what FEMA is doing to work with both Georgia and Florida on Hurricane Michael relief?
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to Georgia, I believe we have roughly 69 counties declared for at least public assistance. Not all, I think it's 17 or 18 counties for individual assistance that we're working with. Georgia, what's interesting about expectations is that what Georgia learned is that hurricanes are not just a coastal problem. And the problem with Georgia is more, not only did people lose their homes and livelihood, but the most tremendous impact in Georgia was one that was agricultural. That's right. There were generational losses. You didn't just lose this year's crop, you lost the ability, you lost all your trees that it takes 10 years to regrow to be productive. And so the response and working through Homer Bryson, the director of Georgia Emergency Management Agency, where I started my career, by the way, we are in constant communication, with him and trying to, here again, bring the whole suite of the federal government assistance that comes down to alleviate the comprehensive problem. So it's one thing for us to fix broken infrastructure and try to I think we've put close to $10 million in the hands of Georgians through individual assistance, but then it requires USDA and agriculture to come in to deal with the economic losses that the farmers went through. Florida, what happened in Mexico Beach is something that all of you should go down and see. It's a lesson learned, and I really don't care where people want to live, but there's a risk to live in different places. And if you're going to live along the coast, then you need robust building codes and standards and zone planning. That's the key to reducing the disaster. And Mexico Beach right now is one of these areas where we have to say, how do we do this right if we rebuild Paradise so that we don't go through this again? And Florida was a tremendous hit, and it wasn't just along the coast, it was inland. And it's going to take us years to help Georgia and Florida overcome what Hurricane Michael was.
Yes, the generational loss with the agricultural community is specifically tops on my mind when it relates to Georgia. It is absolutely catastrophic and apocalyptic, really, looking from the panhandle of Florida and areas of Georgia. One other question, just in light of some of the previous discussion that's already taken place relating to Puerto Rico and the reality that FEMA is not first and foremost a first responder. But how do you plan to work differently with state, local, tribal, territorial entities in the future where there are identifiable systemic vulnerabilities? What's the plan to help prepare in the future?
So here again, I go back to the example of the chair. We got to make sure that all 4 of those legs are there. In regards to Puerto Rico, FEMA is now one of the largest employers in the Commonwealth. We've hired, I think we have over 2,400 people there, but I think we've hired 1,800 people locally. We've got the best and brightest in Puerto Rico learning the backbone of emergency management, because what we've got to be able to do is build a robust Puerto Rican emergency management agency at the state level. We're trying to work daily with the 78 municipalities to bolster a capability that was not existent before the storm, and we're making sure that we shore up the capabilities. We've been through multiple exercises. We're rewriting the national response framework to incorporate the private sector much better as well, because at the end of the day, FEMA doesn't own most of the infrastructure. We don't own any of it. The private sector owns the infrastructure, so we have to make sure that the private sector is in the front of every bit of our disaster response, that they tell us what they need. Where do they need debris removed so that they can get to their infrastructure? There's a ton of things that are taking place there, but I'm also a believer in outcome-driven recovery. We use what's called Section 428 of the Stafford Act to make sure that every project worksheet, when we rebuild a school system or the hospital system, that it's done in a resilient fashion. That the mitigation is put to the forefront of every dollar that we spend, so that we're not doing this again and again and again.
Well, thank you again. There's no perfect agency, but thank you for the work and the leadership you're providing to make this the best it can be in the worst of times, and we appreciate it. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Heiss yields back. Ms. Velasquez. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Lone, I am a Puerto Rican American citizen, as well as Luis Gutierrez. So when I hear you trying to blame the local government, I get angry. And I get angry because of your lack of understanding of the political reality of Puerto Rico and the United States. And I have said this in the past. Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States of America. And with that comes responsibilities of the U.S. government. The president, when he went to Puerto Rico, he said that Katrina was catastrophic, that it was a catastrophe. Yet, Maria wasn't, because only 16 deaths were the official count. So knowing what we know now, close to 3,000, do you consider Maria to be a catastrophe?
Ma'am, absolutely.
Yes.
My agency works every day.
Thank you. Just say
every
yes
day.
or no.
Yep.
Because I have a lot to say. So knowing what we knew, that a Category 5 was on its track to hit Puerto Rico, knowing what we knew, that Puerto Rico's economy was in shambles, not because of Puerto Rico, but because of policies that have been enacted here in the U.S. Congress. They ended 936. And so all the big corporations packed and came home. They didn't have incentives to be in Puerto Rico. So why did the Puerto Rico economy is in shambles? Because we don't have an economic model in Puerto Rico that is ingrained into the needs of the people of Puerto Rico, but rather the interests of American corporations. In 1984, this Congress ended the ability of Puerto Rico to file for bankruptcy. PREPA and all the financial crisis that they're facing, we knew that the power grid was very vulnerable. So knowing what we knew, what predisposition of federal assets were in place prior to Hurricane Maria making landfall. Did we have enough food? Did we have enough gasoline? Did we have enough manpower? Knowing that Maria was on its way to hit Puerto Rico. Mr. Long, what was the communication like between FEMA and the White House before Maria and after Maria? Who did you speak with at the White House concerning disaster response in Puerto Rico? Because the president, in his mind, didn't believe that it was a massive catastrophe based on the fact that only 16 or 17 people were dead. And to me, it really brings the issue of how did that official count shaped the response from the federal government in the mind of the president?
Ma'am, so here again, there were two hits. Irma was first, and then Maria, as you well know, and both packed a severe punch. Before Irma came, we preloaded to the capacity that our Caribbean Area Distribution and Logistics Office could hold when it came to food and water. We pre-positioned a lot of assets and pushed forward, but when you have two hits in succession, it requires more than FEMA. And listen, I work extremely hard every day with the Puerto Rican government.
And I am not taking that away from you. Yeah. I am not taking that away either from the workforce from FEMA in Puerto Rico. But I want you to understand the responsibility of the federal government regarding Puerto Rico and Puerto Rican American citizens.
Sure.
Okay?
And, yeah, absolutely.
My uncle didn't go to war defending the national security of our nation, for nothing. He basically, like many other Puerto Rican veterans, are being willing to make the ultimate sacrifice for our nation. So when you sit there and trying to blame the local government, you need to also learn about the history of Puerto Rico and the United States.
Ma'am, I don't blame anybody in a disaster. Everybody blames FEMA, and that's fine, as I've said, but I don't blame anybody. My staff
Puerto Rico doesn't have the ability to have the kind of response in place and preparedness when they were in bankruptcy.
To build that capability, ma'am. That's what I'm saying. Help me build Puerto Rico's capability. That's what I do every day.
For once, make sure that you have oversight in place when you are making sure that FEMA funds will primarily be used to repair houses in Puerto Rico and not line the pockets of contractors, the majority of whom appear to be based in the mainland. So let's use this opportunity to help rebuild the Puerto Rican economy by making sure that the billions of dollars that go to Puerto Rico to rebuild and to make it resilient stay in Puerto Rico.
Man, we've put $15 billion to work in Puerto Rico already. We've rebuilt and made safe, sanitary, and functional over 100,000 homes. It's been a tremendous effort. I'd be happy to update you on it.
The other advice that I have for you, sir, I was in Puerto Rico with Nancy Pelosi and an entire delegation, and we met with FEMA and the fine employees from FEMA. You need to put standards in place, and when you issue a directive, make sure that everyone from San Juan to the most remote part of the island in your shop know what that new directive means so that we do not shortchange the people of Puerto Rico.
The gentlelady's out of time and yields back. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Ms. Groffman, is recognized.
Well, I'll tell you, Mr. Long, I think I have three committees. This is easily the busiest of the three committees. We have people testify between this committee and subcommittees just constantly. I think you're one of the most on-the-ball people we've had testify before us. So I'd like to thank you for the job you're doing. I think sometimes people sit back home and watch these hearings, and we have to, sometimes I think people make inflammatory statements, and we kind of have to straighten things out for people back home. You hear this story that 3,000 people were, well, first of all, I want to talk a little bit. You first took this job in the beginning of 2017? You had 3 hurricanes in 2017, right?
So I had been in office 2 months, and then Harvey, Irma, and Maria hit, but we had 75 total disasters last year, if I recall correctly.
And how many hurricanes do you have to deal with? You had 3.
We've had 8 landfalling hurricanes. 6 of them are majors, but prior to me coming on board, the nation had not been hit by a major hurricane in 11 years.
Okay, and you had 3?
I've had 6 major landfalling hurricanes. I had 3 in 17, and I think 3 this year. It's hard to keep up.
I'd just say the 3 in 17. When was the last time we had that much volume of damage done in 1 year?
I would say that in 2004 we were hit with 4 major hurricanes in 6 weeks. I believe it was Charlie, Francis, Jean, and Ivan. And then in 2005, I think we had Katrina, Rita, and Ike. And then we went 11 years, roughly 11 years without anything.
Okay, so you had a very, very, very lot on your plate, and I think the public ought to understand that. Now, there are a couple of people today who talk about 3,000 deaths, and of course, when I think of a death connected to a hurricane, I'm sure the people back home think of somebody drowning, somebody due to wind, you know, dying from that. Every death is a tragedy, but I want one more time to understand, when they come up with that 3,000 figure, how many people really, the way a layman would say, died because of a hurricane, died because of the hurricane?
Because of direct deaths or indirect deaths?
Correct.
I don't remember what the direct death number was put forward by the medical examining officer in Puerto Rico, but I don't believe any of it's accurate. In regards to the 3,000, you would have to ask Dr. Goldman and how she determined that. But I've read the GW study, I've read the Harvard study. They all measure different time frames and different characteristics, but not one of them determines what the cause of death is in those studies. And I don't think we know what the deaths were. It was a tremendous impact, and as I've said, one death is a death too many that we try to work against every day.
I'll give you an example. In Wisconsin, they used to report the number of deer hunting deaths every year. Somebody died of a heart attack, and they'd call the heart attack was caused by deer hunting. It wasn't caused by deer hunting. The guy died of a heart attack. How many, do you have even, well, we'll ask Major General Spellman, do you have an approximate number of people who died caused by these, direct caused by these hurricanes?
No, sir.
Okay. Okay. But it's the 3,000 number is not based on what a layman would caused by a hurricane, drowned, you know, due to the wind, house collapsed or something, correct?
You're right. So I think, if I remember correctly, the indirect or the direct death number that was put forward by, by the colony was 65. But that would be like structural collapse, storm surge, wind, waves, whatever it could have been. In regards to the 3,000 deaths, it could have been someone injured trying to clean debris off of their yard. It could have been someone who had a heart attack 6 months after Maria, because what I believe Dr. Goldman's study measures is what was the average over time. Here again, FEMA doesn't determine cause of death. We have to take the local government's word for what the death is, and I think that the study rightfully exposes that there were flaws in the capability of Puerto Rico to accurately track and put forward. But I can tell you this, we've taken specific action. I've mission assigned the Department of Defense. I've mobilized disaster mortuary teams to take care of, to try to alleviate the issue in the Commonwealth on determining or processing deaths, because there is a backlog that exists. So here again, I'm having to step in to do that job as well.
I'm sure the higher the number you get, the more the politicians hope they get, press on what they say. But I think it's important to remember that the 3,000 number is different what the average person would think. I was not aware until today. You right now are tasked with sometimes repairing infrastructure to be far better than the infrastructure that was there before the hurricane?
Yeah, so I had to ask for special authorities. It's no secret that the infrastructure was not well maintained. And typically, FEMA does not have the authority to fix anything that was not maintained by a local or a state government. So I asked, specifically recognizing this problem and knowing how long the long-term recovery was going to be, I had to seek special authority from Congress to be able to fix it. And that's what we're pushing through. Now, here's what we're doing to make sure that we don't go through this again and that we are building a more economically viable and resilient Puerto Rico. We're utilizing outcome-driven recovery through the 428 plan to factor in mitigation. One of the largest efforts underway is the education sector and trying to rebuild schools. But once that's done, what I would ask is everyone on the committee to make sure that the agencies in charge of the schools or in charge of the power system, once it's all rebuilt, is that there's actually a plan to maintain it in the future so that we don't go through this again.
Okay, well, I just, you know, from my perspective, so you know, I think last year, maybe I'm off this number by 1 or 2%, the federal government borrows 22% of every dollar spent. There's nobody as broke as the federal government. I think it's something we're going to have to look out in the future if we wind up having to pay to make things better than they were beforehand, perhaps better than many Americans have right now who are paying the taxes for this. It's something that we ought to look into. But I'd like to thank you one more time for coming over here. And I'm sorry because I think some people are trying to make political points at your expense, which is, I think you're doing a tremendous job. Thank you much.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Gutierrez, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, Mr. Chairman, now that I know that my words cannot do you any harm, I would like to say that as I leave Congress, I'm happy to know that I leave Congress having made a great friendship with you over the years that we've served together. And I wanted to put that in the record somewhere now that someone can't send a direct mail piece.
Thank you, and you could have said it even when it did hurt me. I wouldn't have minded. Thank you.
Unfortunately, that's part of the reality of Washington, D.C., that you can't tell people who you sometimes admire or, you know, are a friend with or whose company you cherish. Having said that, look, I think we have to fundamentally understand Maria within the context of the federal government. Why? I know you say to me, oh, that's all local. The federal government, right, has the sovereignty over the island of Puerto Rico. What does that mean? Any rule and any legislation that we pass here in the Congress of the United States is immediately implemented over the island of Puerto Rico. I mean, you say, oh, well, you know, the infrastructure wasn't there, some of the stuff. You eat Chiquita bananas on a tropical island in Puerto Rico. But I would suggest that you check why that is. And this is the imposition, right, of rules of the Congress of the United States over what can be grown, planted, and what can be done. The island of Puerto Rico, I'm sure you have noticed now, produces what it doesn't consume and consumes what it doesn't produce. A classical colonial situation of subjugation of the people of Puerto Rico. Now, open up a new Walmart or Walgreens, just like that. Have opportunities for economic investment where people actually get jobs, very slow. As a matter of fact, the Congress of the United States has stripped the ability of the people of Puerto Rico to have those kinds of jobs and to do what we have to do. Look, I came here to say to the chairman and to all of those that are here, you have a huge task because of your boss. It was the President of the United States that said, the people of Puerto Rico are busting the budget. And I go back to what my colleague, Nidia Velázquez, said. Did we bust the budget when thousands of us died in times of war? Isn't the highest tax that anyone can pay that of their blood and that of their life? And Puerto Ricans have obviously done that. Second, the President of the United States said, basically said Puerto Ricans are lazy. Now, Mexicans are murderers, rapists, and drug dealers. And Puerto Rico, well, you had a hurricane. Why do I say that? Because he said they want the federal government to do everything for them. That is a lie. How do I know it's a lie? Because although this administration would not allow members of Congress to use, right, Air Force facilities to fly to the island of Puerto Rico that we wanted to, I got on a plane. I know Nidia got on, Congresswoman Velasquez, sorry for being so personal, Nidia, got on a plane too. We were able to get there with no assistance. Now, I want to make sure that I also make this clear. I know that there are hundreds of men and women that work at FEMA every day, that go out there to do an outstanding job. I see them, I've met with them, and I know there are members of the armed forces of the United States that have been out there. But this is the most powerful, richest, most technologically advanced country in the world. So in spite of what you saw them do, we didn't do what we can. We're rich, we're powerful, we're technologically advanced. We still have blue tarps a year and a half later over people's roofs. The light still goes out. The water still ceases to come. People are still fleeing the island. And I just wanted to say, as you make your plans, I know that we have a president of the United States that said in his gut, you know, he's really intelligent, but in his gut, he doesn't believe that climate change is real, although 13 governmental agencies and hundreds of scientists, the hundreds of thousands of Puerto Ricans that no longer live on that island, live in Chicago, they live in Florida, they live throughout the United States. Those are climate change refugees. The hurricanes are coming back. The waters are getting warmer. Prepare, because on the low side, Mr. Director, it's 3,000. On the high side, it's 4,500. People died. Compare that to how many people died in the last hurricane. Unfortunately, one life is one life too many. But when you think you can take immediately after the last hurricane in Florida, right, and look at your numbers, I bet you don't get to 100, thank God, right? Yet in Puerto Rico, it's 3,000 to 4,500, and the hurricanes are coming back. So I say, look, for what you did, thank you. For what you have to prepare, I urge you to do it. And that's why I came here this morning. Thank you so much.
Gentleman from Illinois yields back. I thank you for what you said and for 8 years of friendship.
Thank you very much.
The gentleman from Louisiana has patiently been waiting and has constantly been engaged and involved with this issue, even though he's not on our committee. So we welcome you. The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, I do want to commend your staff for putting the report together. I think it identified a number of really important issues that not just face the 2017 or 2018 disasters, but certainly has identified some areas for improvement for the future disasters that we know are going to be coming. Mr. Chairman, I think it's noteworthy that since 1980, I believe we've had about 220 disasters that have cost our nation over $1 billion each, and we've spent about $1.5 trillion responding to these disasters. There is a better way. Whether it's the deaths, it's the money, there is a better way. As you know, we did pass the Disaster Reform and Recovery Act that the President has signed into law. I think that it did address a number of important issues, providing additional flexibility, providing you some additional tools, and I think better integration with the capabilities of state and local governments. But I want to be clear, we have more to do. Administrator, I do appreciate you being here, and I know you've got an incredibly tough job to do. Every disaster is unpredictable, and therefore trying to plan for that exact scenario is virtually impossible. Doesn't mean we shouldn't try, but it is virtually impossible. You and I have met a number of times, and I've expressed some frustration, and I believe you commented on some of those early on. In the disaster that we had in August of 2016, our flood, 1,000-year flood there, I've dealt with FEMA, the Corps of Engineers, with HUD, with SBA, with the United States Department of Agriculture, with the Coast Guard, and other agencies. It is incredible trying to deal with this whole alphabet soup of agencies while trying to deliver real, applicable, efficient solutions to disaster victims. Sure. One issue we're dealing with right now, FEMA under NFIP, is requiring that you have a certain freeboard for the elevation of homes under an executive order that was issued under the previous administration that has since been rescinded. HUD requires, I believe it's a 2-foot higher freeboard. So if we're using CDBG-DR dollars to recover homes, somebody complied with a FEMA standard, all of a sudden you're no longer in compliance with a HUD standard that was put together after an executive order under the previous administration that has been rescinded. These people are now not eligible to get reimbursed for rebuilding their homes. Good. That is one example of many that is idiotic, and it is actually re-victimizing our survivors from some of these disasters. We need to continue working on making sure we do a better job integrating the efforts of the various agencies or consolidating some of these efforts within your agency. On the flood insurance program, something that has been a very hot topic here. The state of Louisiana is at the bottom of one of the largest watersheds in the world. We drain from Montana to New York, 2 Canadian provinces, all down to Louisiana. Additional development sends more water into that watershed, into our communities, which makes us more vulnerable. Number 2, as a result of the Corps of Engineers' efforts to train the river, we've lost about 2,000 square miles of our coast, making the Gulf of Mexico that much closer to us. We've got vulnerabilities from the north, vulnerabilities from the south, neither of which our citizens had a damn thing to do with. How do I explain to our citizens that they're going to be charged higher flood insurance rates whenever they had absolutely no control over the additional vulnerability?
So, Congressman, first of all, the DRRA is transformational for our agency, and I think there's over 64 different provisions that we're trying to get through. You've made your intent very clear. I think we're both a cut of the same piece of cloth.
I think you and I are the only 2 nerds that care about that bill, but I'm excited.
I'm telling you, it truly is impressive, and I'm very thankful for it. I do think that it's going to do a lot of help. We've got a long way to go. We're both very passionate, and the definition of passion is the right amount of love and anger at the same time. I want to reduce the complexity. I understand exactly what you're talking about. I do think there needs to be a consolidation of disaster recovery funds coming down. But when it comes to the NFIP, what I would ask is that instead of extending it 1 week or extending it, 3 months, can we extend it a year, but make a commitment at the end of that year that we will truly make transformational changes to the NFIP rather than kicking that can down the road because the program is not financially solvent, it's broken, and I am trying to do the best with a program that needs to be fundamentally changed to account for affordability. And in some cases, maybe it's a transformational change in the entire industry. Why can't you get a policy that's all hazards to begin with?
Amen to everything you just said. I'm going to make those points on the House floor today when we try and extend this thing for 1 week. I agree with you 100%, but I'll tell you something else, Administrator, and I think your friend to your left is one that's really key on this. Flood insurance is defense. It's reactive, it's defense. One of the most cost-effective things we can do based on countless studies is bringing an offense to the table, making sure that these guys have the tools, the resources they need to be proactive. Under the DARA bill, as you know, we did the pre-disaster mitigation at the 6%, so we're trying to bring some offense there. Under the DARA bill, we try to provide some flexibility where HMGP can be used for core projects, but we have got to continue working, which, by the way, some of your staffers are fighting us on, but it's law. But we've got to continue to bring an offense to the table. You can't just have a defense like flood insurance program. It's financially unsustainable. I see my time. Mr. Chairman, I want to make 2 points. Number one, that disaster bill has a provision in there regarding duplication of benefits under the Stafford Act. There was a 45-day clock for the administration to make a decision on a waiver request for CDBGR, SBA duplication of benefits. It is 50-something days, and we have heard nothing. We have $250 million sitting in the bank. We have several thousand families that cannot get back into their homes or other financial duress. Some people have had to sell their homes. The money's in the bank. It's already been appropriated. This is all about complying with the law that is not being complied with today. This is a major issue that is affecting several thousand people. I want to ask you to please engage on this. This needs to be fixed. The timeline has been passed.
I hear you loud and clear.
Number 2, we have a number of Louisiana contractors that are doing work on the STEP program in Virgin Islands. They have been waiting several months to be paid. Administrator, you're well aware that having additional competition and expertise in these programs is really important to deliver value to taxpayers and to have efficient solutions. We can't have those kind of response times for paying these contractors for work. It's going to prevent them from coming back in when you need their help in the future.
Yep, absolutely. I'll look into it. Typically, we would grant the money to the state, and it would be paid through the state or through the Virgin Islands government. So I'll check into that. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I know I'm over time. I just want to say to you that this committee's role in bringing all these agencies together, the flood insurance program, the Corps of Engineers, and many other resiliency programs and response programs. I think it's really important to make sure that we don't stop at the reforms that were just signed into law, but we continue moving forward. I think we can help save lives and save money, and I appreciate you holding this hearing and allowing us to be here.
Well, I thank the gentleman, and I thank you for your persistent interest in this. Even though you are not on this committee, you would not know it from the number of times you have mentioned the issues to me on the floor, and for that, I am grateful. Major General Spellman, there's a rule in the justice system. It's called the rule of completeness. Some people call it the rule of fairness. It's a pretty simple proposition that you can't just tell part of the story. You got to tell a whole story. Most of us were brought up, you know, you're going to tell it all. In fact, the oath that I just administered to y'all, if I remember correctly, it says to tell the truth, and then it says to tell the whole truth. It's called the rule of completeness or the rule of fairness. You may have noticed we do not have that rule in politics. What you have in politics is selective amnesia and a hyper-focus on pointing out what your political adversaries have not done, as opposed to what they have done. So I listened to my friend from Maryland in his opening, decrying the fact that we have not had a public hearing. We had one today. Every single member ran out of time. You get 5 minutes. Now, the advantage for members of Congress is that you're on television. That's the big advantage. The disadvantage is you are limited to 5 minutes, and you have to unlock the mysteries of the world in 5 minutes, and I let every single one of them go over. Every single one of them. Some of them went over a lot, because you cannot effectively question anything in 5 minutes. So, keeping with the rule of completeness and the rule of fairness, I want to let you know what, Garrett, I appreciate you mentioning the word staff. I appreciate you doing that. I don't mind if my colleagues take shots at other members of Congress. I don't mind that. We all sign up for it. What Luis Gutierrez did is rare. That's really, really rare. To say something across the aisle, complimentary, publicly, he's a unicorn. That doesn't happen. I get that. But Garrett, you mentioned staff. So I want to let you know what staff has done as it relates to our fellow citizens who are suffering due to natural disaster. October of 2017, no, I did not misspeak. It's not October of 2018, October of 2017. We had a member briefing with FEMA. Now, what, may you ask, is a member briefing? It is an opportunity for members of Congress to come and ask every question that they have. There is no time constraint. There is no time limit. You're not going to get cut off by a chairperson. You can ask whatever you want to ask, which is why I prefer briefings. So someone who represents a district that is impacted by hurricanes is not limited to 5 minutes. October the 3rd, 2017, a member briefing with officials from FEMA. October 11th, 2017, a member briefing with officials from the DOD and the Army Corps of Engineers. October of 2017. Letters went to HHS, DOD, including the Army Corps of Engineers, DHS, including FEMA, requesting documents. If memory serves me correctly, this committee has accessed over 18,000 documents. You did not hear that in the opening statement given by my friend from Maryland. So we're up to 2 member briefings and 18,000 documents, and we're not out of October of 2017 yet. And that's when committee staff traveled to Texas. Not for 5 minutes and a YouTube opportunity, but to actually talk to their fellow Americans who have been devastated. So, Garrett, that's why I appreciate you mentioning staff. It was staff that made that trip to check on the well-being of their fellow Americans. November of 2017, a follow-up briefing, Mr. Long with FEMA on disaster contracting and reimbursements. That's over a year ago. January of 2018, a letter to the GAO requesting a comprehensive evaluation of the federal government's preparedness, response, recovery efforts for hurricanes and wildfires. January 2018, another briefing with HHS on response and recovery. February of 2018, another meeting with the GAO on their hurricane response in 2017. March of 2018, a briefing with the American Red Cross. March of 2018, a field hearing in the U.S. Virgin Islands. There were members that went. It was mainly staff on the ground in an area impacted by a devastating hurricane, hearing from their fellow Americans about how they can help make things better. You did not hear that in the opening statement given by my friend from Maryland. April of 2018, a briefing on FEMA's Section 428 program. April of 2018, committee staff traveled to Puerto Rico so they could see firsthand the devastation wreaked upon their fellow citizens. I get taking shots at Congress. I get it. I get it. It was staff that did that. I didn't hear that mentioned in my friend from Maryland's opening. June of 2018, another meeting with the GAO. August of 2018, another briefing with FEMA. September of 2018, Administrator Long, you may recall a letter from me and others asking you for even more information, more than the 18,000 that we'd already received. And then we get to October of this year. And Garrett, this is why I'm grateful that you mentioned what you did, because the staff released a comprehensive report that it had done studying other natural disasters, trying to figure out how we can do a better job. You would know none of that had you simply listened to the opening statement given by my friend on the other side. So the roles will be reversed come January. I'll be gone. We'll be in the minority. I hope the minority treats the majority with more fairness than the minority treated the majority today. And what I really hope is you draw a line of demarcation. You can criticize members of Congress all you want, but staff spent well over a year trying to figure out how to make their fellow citizens' lives better, and I didn't hear a damn word about it in the opening statement given by my friend from Maryland. So thank you for coming today. Thank you. Work harder. Do everything you can to improve our fellow citizens' lives. Work harder. And I'm sure that Congress will continue its oversight responsibilities in 2018. With that, the record will remain open for anyone to submit opening statements, submit questions for the record. Thank you again for your time and your collegiality with the committee and with one another. And with that, we are adjourned.
Un chinchín más largo de lo que pensaba.
Some news as this hearing comes to a close. Two items dealing with Michael Cohen, President Trump's ex-attorney. This morning, Mr. Cohen made a surprise appearance in a courtroom in New York announcing he's pleading guilty to lying to Congress about work he did on a Trump real estate deal in Russia. House Speaker Paul Ryan addressed the issue this morning during a Washington Post interview. We will show that to you, and that'll be followed by remarks from President Trump on the issue.